let's move on to the probably the key questions I have about your campaign is constitutionally limited government. If there's and I talked about some of this with Ryan, how do you define that? I mean, it means a lot of things to a lot of people, and it kind of implies, at least to me and to a lot of people, that government has overstepped. Where has government overstepped?
Well, first there were a couple of questions, and there may be more than a couple. But you look to the Constitution itself, Article 1, Section 8, lays out the enumerated powers. So that's where you go to. To interpret those different provisions, we do have the courts. Now, I think it is helpful for members of Congress also since they have a duty to uphold and respect the Constitution of the United States, also look to the Constitution themselves and pull it out, hopefully on a regular basis. I think members of Congress, I think Congress as a body should be required to cite which provisions a particular piece of legislation fall under to justify its existence, rather than leaving that ambiguous whenever a bill is drafted and presented.
So you're talking article blank, section whatever, clause whatever.
This is authorized by this particular provision in our Constitution, right? So that would narrow the scope of the debate. Now, yes, I do think that our government, I'm quite sure it's overstepped its bounds in various areas over the course of recent decades. Typically, and that's been in its construction of a couple of different provisions. One is the Interstate Commerce Clause, under which federal government action is frequently justified.
Are we going to have a Rand Paul moment?
No, we're not.
Okay, just asking.
The Interstate Commerce Clause, though, is back during the New Deal era, there was a change in how all of this was interpreted, and seemingly everything falls under the Commerce Clause if you can tell the story correctly, right? So I think sometimes legislation can be justified on other grounds, but the Commerce Clause is used, and I think it becomes a vehicle under which too many things get passed under that justification. And then you've got the General Welfare Clause, which was originally planned to be a brake on the ability of Congress to tax and spend, only for the general welfare. It wasn't supposed to be a standalone justification for passing anything that might be argued to be in the general welfare. So
that's an interesting interpretation. I hadn't heard that. Let's maybe if we were a little bit more specific. You mentioned the New Deal. I know one of the things, some of the things that came out of that was labor reform, minimum wage, things like that. Is that all the court cases, League of Cities, there's a few others, Garcia, those types of Supreme Court cases.
Well,
should the federal government weigh in, OSHA, minimum wage, all those types of things that kind of came out of that era? I mean, that was one of the Supreme Court decisions during the New Deal that they objected to was minimum wage.
What I would advocate for, and this may or may not strike you as satisfactory, but I feel like I'm running for a legislative office here and not a judicial office. So rather than getting into case by case, what I will do as a member of Congress is consult and to scrutinize each piece of legislation, to ask members of my staff who will be schooled in these matters, and to bring in legal experts who can advise me as to whether or not something is consistent with the Constitution. I will ask hard questions. I am not...
Well, that's why I'm asking you if you think that the minimum wage laws and OSHA and some of these other things are constitutionally valid for companies that don't engage in...
I think the minimum wage laws and OSHA laws can be criticized on economic grounds, of which I'm more conversant on those.
Okay.
Of course, I'll be scrutinizing them and their legal merits and asking those questions when those matters come before me.
Okay.
But I would criticize them instead on the detrimental economic impact.
So you wouldn't say that the minimum wage laws violate the Constitution, 10th Amendment, anything
It's not
like
something
that?
I'm prepared to say right now.
Okay. So we'll put OSHA under that as well. EPA.
I reserve the right, with due advisement from others, though, to update that. But as I said, I'm not prepared to say that right now.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I want to be fair because
I'm trying to be accurate,
right,
and precise, and very straightforward. But I'm also going to tell you if there's something I'm not prepared to say right now, and leave it at that.
Because when I looked at your background, and you were chapter president of the Federalist Society, and they have very distinct views about the role of government. And you've hinged your campaign on the role of government and constitutional limitations, which is why I'm getting into these different issues.
Yeah.
And I realize that a lot of these are contentious, and if you don't want to weigh in,
no, that's right.
and I understand, what happened with Rand Paul and civil rights. And
my campaign is very much focused on referencing the Constitution and wherever possible, pushing powers from the federal level of government back to the state level, and even serving as a mouthpiece to push powers from the state level of government, state capitals, down to local levels, and from there, the logical extension is from local levels down to private individuals.
Okay.
I think that is the best way to ensure that government is close to the people and that people retain their individual liberties.